Is the C50 Canon's best cinema camera? We think it could be. Before we start, we'd like to give a big thanks to Cinemachine for letting us use their space to shoot this video in, and we'd also like to thank Gray and Joanne for helping us with some of our testing. Now this video is going to be a little bit more relaxed and in-depth than some of our others because I've got a lot of hands-on experience with Canon cinema cameras and I've got a lot to say as a result. When Canon introduced the C50, I felt it was a no-brainer for rigging to cars, gimbals, and doing that nimble shooting stuff. No, it does not have IBIS, which would definitely have been nice, but there are solutions for that, so it's not a deal breaker for me. Because the C50 is so much cheaper and it doesn't have the same sensor as the C400, unlike the C80, I think we all fully expected a noticeable drop in performance. But as we know, specs can sometimes be misleading, and in this case, what's surprising is just how little a difference there actually is between these cameras in the real world. For perspective, we covered the C400 in a video on this channel before it came out, and we spoke a lot about its features and compared it against an FX6, C500 Mark II, and the C70. I've also had the camera since it was released, and I've taken it across Western Australia for the corporate, TVC, and film work that I do. I've also done jobs on almost every Canon cinema camera since the C500 Mark II, so I'm pretty familiar with Canon's whole cinema ecosystem at this point. Before we get into some of the pros and cons of the C50 compared to other Canon cinema cameras, let's talk about its dynamic range and latitude. Latitude represents how forgiving a camera is when things don't go perfectly on set, and you film either too dark or too bright and have to fix it in post. We did some basic tests here in both XFAVC and RAW-HQ, and we'll pin a comment down below explaining exactly how we handled those tests. But here's the short version of what we found. Highlights on both cameras started to clip at around 4 stops overexposed. Now this isn't surprising because it mirrors exactly how every Canon camera with C-Log2 behaves in our experience. Even the dual gain output sensors from the C70 clip highlights at the same place. Shadows, however, are different. In RAW, they stay fairly clean up to about 3 stops underexposed, and at 4 stops they need serious noise reduction, but they are salvageable. The C400 does have less color noise when it's deeply underexposed, but the noise that it does have is a little mushier. The C50, on the other hand, has a finer grained noise with a little more color issues, which clean up in a very similar way after tweaking. On the C50, you need to tint the shadows a little bit to get rid of unwanted color, and because you're taking out so much shadow color, you lose a little bit of contrast sooner than on the C400. Your blacks start to drift towards gray, which is a classic sign of having a reduced dynamic range in the shadows. With that said, by the time this actually becomes noticeable, both cameras are so noisy that the footage really isn't usable anyway, in my experience. In XFAVC, we found that both cameras hold up a little bit better in the shadows without denoising, which makes a lot of sense because the RAW has less processing in camera. But surprisingly, the C50 image feels a little bit more organic to me, while the C400 can feel a little bit more digital, especially as you lower the bit rates down from the default maximum of 500 in all-I. At higher bit rates and in RAW, the differences mostly disappear, but it's still pretty surprising to see that the C50 is doing a little bit better in my opinion. I think the higher resolution and finer noise that the C50 has is slightly easier for the camera to process internally. And the C50 is a little bit sharper overall than the C400 out of the box, so you might want to soften it a bit in post if you are looking to get these cameras to match. We then also tested the C50 in its Super 35 mode because Canon claims 16 stops of dynamic range there compared to 15 plus in the full frame mode. And while the shadows might be a little bit cleaner, they got a bit mushier and not really any better than they were in full frame in my opinion. And if anything, I think I like them a little bit less. At higher ISOs, the C50 also impressed us. At 6400 base ISO, it's about as clean as the C400 is at 3200. So the C50, while it doesn't have that 12800 third base that the C400 has, it effectively gives you an extra usable stop over the C400's middle base ISO. And I'd say that the C50 will be a pretty good performer in low light as a result. It's also worth noting that on both cameras, the auto base ISO setting is not worth using in our opinion unless you have to. It is functional, but you'll get much better results, particularly cleaner shadows, if you choose your base ISO first and set your ISO manually from there instead. Something else that we were curious about is how the cameras would behave if we set the base ISO and then exposed in an ISO higher or lower than that base. So at base ISO, we set the cameras to ISO 400. We ended up losing 1 stop in the highlights, but moved that information into the shadows and we gained a stop there. They got cleaner. And that's really cool to know. If you're filming darker scenes without a lot of highlight information, you might want to expose at an ISO value lower than whatever base ISO you are set at. The same, however, was not true with highlights. We didn't get any more information in the clipping bits at higher ISOs, and we still lost the information in the shadows. We don't know if this is because of how Canon's ISO gain structure works, or maybe it's just C-Log2, but it is a little bit unfortunate. Normally on most cinema cameras, you can play with the latitude both directions. But hey, it's still something that you can get cleaner shadows when you need them. Lastly, in terms of rolling shutter, yes, the C400 is technically a little bit better, but so far in the real world, I have not noticed a difference at all. Now let's talk about some of the C50's pros, cons, and quirks. First, the top handle. It's fantastic. Ergonomically, it's one of the best that we've ever used, and having full-size XLRs is a real win. Using this camera has honestly been a blast because of how well it all works and feels in the hand. With that said, Canon need to revise the C50's audio menu because it's slower and more confusing than the rest of the EOS cinema line, and they should all work consistently in our opinion instead of having one camera that works differently. When it comes to internal ND filters, no, the C50 does not have any, but this has never been a deal breaker for me on smaller cameras. Now, IBIS on small cameras is a big deal for some people, and Taylor and I actually don't fully agree on how big a deal it really is. I don't mind it as much, but it's a real turnoff for him. While neither of these cameras have IBIS, it is definitely more noticeable on the smaller and lighter C50, and it's lighter than it looks, by the way. My approach here is straightforward. I bought it to rig out. If I'm shooting handheld, I use a cine saddle or a lens with optical stabilization, and sometimes we enable Canon's fantastic digital stabilization, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. Or we build up the camera slightly to give it more weight and places to hold against my body for smoothness. But because I'm also using the Smallrig Vl-ock plate that mounts quickly via Arcus Swiss on the camera cage and an LPE6P dummy battery, I get effectively all-day run times and much more stable handheld rigs. Now, while I think having IBIS would have been really nice in this camera, I think even Taylor would agree that Canon's IBIS for video in their other bodies can sometimes have some distracting corner wobbles, and maybe it's not quite as ready for full-time video work as Panasonic or Sony's IBIS, which both work a lot better in our testing. I've also not personally had many clients who accept IBIS when they want smooth shots. They kind of expect a gimbal or stabilization rigs. Now we know that for some people, Canon's video IBIS is good enough, and for them maybe the R6 III would be worth it. We will be talking a little bit more about that camera's pros and cons towards the end of this video. But for us right now, every time we've used it, it's just not quite there yet for the type of work that we're doing. Now in the meantime, Canon's digital stabilization does work really well, especially now that we have the motion vector for IS setting. This setting enables types of tracking information to be used for digital stabilization, and with the setting on, sometimes the image can be smoother, but the camera can overstabilize a subject, leading to unwanted tracking and warping. This setting does make a bigger difference in our testing on the C50 than it does on the C400, because on the C400 I mostly leave it off to avoid the potential artifacts, and I don't really see a big downside because of the added weight. But on the C50, I actually leave it on most of the time unless there's an issue, because the footage just looks a little bit more micro-jittery without it. I also want to mention that while the electronic stabilization is better than you probably think, and it even has anamorphic correction settings, which is awesome, it does not work in either RAW or OpenGate modes. Speaking about OpenGate, it is excellent to have it on both of these cameras now, but there are limitations. Having only RAW on the C400 and only up to 30 frames per second on both cameras feels restrictive, and we would have loved to see 50 frames per second as an option, even if it was at a lower bit depth, pixel binned, or line skipped. Canon's binning is actually really good, and we already see it in the full-frame 4K 120 frames modes in XFAVC. It's also worth pointing out that the files in OpenGate are huge, and the more compressed codecs that do exist on the C50 are only 420H-VEC instead of 422H.264, so the clips are both lower bit depth and they're slower to edit on most computers, but they are still 10-bit. Even worse though is that the long GOP is extremely heavy to edit. Don't get me wrong, it is nice that the C50 at least has non-RAW options here for OpenGate, but it feels like there's no middle ground choice that's got a good balance between file size, edit performance, and image quality. For context, the all-I OpenGate option on the C50 is actually bigger than the RAW LT option, which is so dumb. There's clearly room for improvement here. And this is actually a note that we have for Blackmagic as well. We absolutely want a Pixis 12K, but the fact that you can only rarely shoot in B-RAW is a huge limitation in our opinions, because sometimes you just need a smaller file. You're probably not going to get away with shooting a lot of interview content in RAW. But moving on, one thing that is cool in OpenGate is anamorphic shooting. And for shooting anamorphic in RAW OpenGate, both cameras show the full sensor area, which makes monitoring harder. On the C400 in its non-OpenGate modes, you see the final scope crop when you enable anamorphic desqueeze, which is much better for monitoring on set. It's only in OpenGate where you see the extra image on the sides that you just don't need. On the C50, however, you always see the full sensor in every single recording mode. Now that's fine if you want it, but if you're using both cameras side by side, they won't look the same and clients are going to notice. Now, you can still enable your crop marks to show where the edges of the screen are, but especially if you're working on these monitors, the image can just get a little bit small to see what you're doing. It's also worth bearing in mind that most third-party monitors cannot do anamorphic desqueeze and cropping to scope, so it's really nice that the camera could do it internally, and now they can't. Canon has told me that they can't apply the same scaling in OpenGate as they can in the normal sensor mode, so maybe a dedicated RAW 4.3 or 6.5 crop would make a lot of sense here. At the very least, the standard recording modes on the C50 do need fixing, or the C400 needs an option to show the full sensor as well. Now, lastly, the C50 also does not currently support LUTs in playback. You see just a flat, washed-out C-Log image. I think Canon are working on an update here, but for now, it's honestly kind of unacceptable, and Canon just don't do stuff like that in the future, okay? With that out of the way, let's finish things up and talk a little bit about the C80, the R5C, and the R6 III. Look, they're all fantastic cameras, and I can see a use case for each of them. Starting with the R5C, because functionally, I think that's the camera that the C50 is most directly replacing in Canon's lineup. The R5C is a very capable hybrid body, but the moment you look at it as a B cam to something like the C400, the differences really start to matter. Not having C-Log 2 and XFAVC combined with the lack of an XLR top handle makes it really hard to integrate cleanly into a workflow. If your work leans more stills hybrid and you need an EVF and a mechanical shutter, flash sync, stuff like that, and you're regularly shooting more stills alongside video, the R5C could still be a great option, and at this point it's normally available for pretty good prices on the used market. But as a video-first camera intended to live alongside a larger camera, I think it doesn't quite fit in as nicely as the C50 does. The R6 Mark III sits in a similar category. On paper, it shares the same sensor as the C50, but it uses a different processor, and in practice that does show up in more shadow noise and less dynamic range in the shadows. Overheating is also a consideration on longer takes and higher frame rates. IBIS is an advantage, especially for shorter handout shots, but we have talked about our feelings towards Canon's video IBIS earlier in the video. But if you are doing shorter takes with lighter rigs and you're okay with it, the R6 III might still be excellent value considering it is cheaper. In a cinema-style kit though, I see it more as a convenient little C cam rather than a true B cam. Lastly, there's the C80. For some shooters, this is probably a better small A cam choice, especially if the C50 feels a little bit limited. For my workflow though, it sits in an awkward middle ground, and I've spoken to many people that agree. The SD cards are also slower and limit the codec choices and are less reliable than CF Express. The camera's body also isn't quite substantial enough in my opinion to feel like a true A cam on larger sets, while also being a little bit too bulky to be genuinely nimble. Now of course you may disagree, but that's just how we feel about it. So in the end, where does that leave you? If you're just starting out, the R6 III might work. If you want a single traditional cinema camera with internal NDs and familiar ergonomics, something like the C80 or the C400 makes a lot of sense. But I have to say, if you're working on smaller sets and you're just kind of starting out, but you want your first proper video camera, you could even make the C50 work with a decent ND filter solution and a gimbal, because it kind of does everything that the others do, and there's nothing really stopping you from making a lot of money with it. But one thing is pretty clear to us at this stage. If you're doing professional work, you need a camera that can move fast and slot in next to a bigger camera body like this one. No one is going to question the footage coming out of the C50, and it becomes really hard to ignore. For me, pairing these two cameras works really well, and they serve such a defined purpose that they complement each other perfectly in terms of their capabilities and shortcomings. And that's why this pairing has earned its place in my kit. But look, that's just how we feel. Let us know down below in the comments if we've missed anything or if you disagree, or even if there's something that you'd like us to cover in more detail in another video. Let us know, and consider giving us a like and a subscribe, and we'll see you next time.